The air on April 11, 1945 was thick with contradictions. It carried the scent of spring blossoming in the ancient forests of Thuringia, a sweet, earthy perfume of life renewed. But it was poisoned by another smell, one that had saturated the soil, the trees, and the very stones for 8 long years. It was the smell of death, of burning flesh, of sickness, of unwashed bodies and human despair. This was the air of Buchenwald. Inside the electrified fences of the concentration camp, perched on the Ettersberg Hill overlooking Weimar, the city of Goethe, Schiller, and the dawn of German democracy, a strange and terrifying silence had fallen. The relentless noise of the camp, the barking dogs, the screaming guards, the clatter of factory machinery, had faded. In its place was a new sound, a low, persistent rumble from the west. It was the sound of approaching American artillery. For the 21,000 skeletal prisoners left inside, this sound was both a prayer answered and a death sentence pending. The SS guards, the architects of this hell, were gone. In the preceding days, they had been a whirlwind of frantic, brutal activity, forcing tens of thousands of prisoners on death marches to other camps, shooting anyone who faltered. But now, the watchtowers stood empty. The camp's commandant, Hermann Pister, and his coterie of murderers had fled, abandoning their creation in a desperate bid to save their own skins. The prisoners were alone, trapped between the ghosts of their tormentors and the guns of their liberators. It was a terrifying limbo, a vacuum where anything could happen. Would the Allies arrive in time, or would some final vengeful spasm of the dying Nazi regime consume them all? The answer to that question lay in an administrative building, near the main gate where the infamous words, "Jedem das Sein," to each his own, were mockingly inscribed. Inside, a telephone rang. It was a jarring, modern sound in a world of primitive suffering. The call was from Gestapo headquarters in Weimar, the town just a few miles down the road. An officer was on the line, his voice crisp with bureaucratic authority. He had an important announcement for the camp administration. He was informing them that explosives were being dispatched to Buchenwald immediately. The orders were clear. Blow up the camp. Destroy the evidence. Destroy the infirmary, the crematorium, the barracks. And with it, destroy every last living inmate. Leave nothing behind for the Americans but ashes and rubble. The man who answered the phone was not an SS officer. He was a prisoner, a Polish political prisoner, an engineer named Gwidon Damazyn. He was part of a secret, highly organized resistance that had been operating within the camp for years. In this moment, with the fate of 21,000 people hanging on his every word, he did not panic. He listened calmly to the Gestapo officer, and then, with an audacity born of utter desperation, he lied. He informed the officer in fluent German that his assistance was appreciated but no longer necessary. There was no need to send explosives. The camp, he explained, had already been blown up. The evidence was gone. The inmates were dead. It was all taken care of. There was a pause on the other end of the line. The officer, likely harried and eager to close his files before his own escape, accepted the information. He thanked the voice on the phone and hung up. A single lie. A few sentences spoken into a Bakelite receiver, a bluff of monumental proportions, had just halted the final act of annihilation. That one brief conversation is a keyhole through which we can see a different story of the Holocaust. It is a story we think we know, a narrative etched into our collective memory in stark black and white images, of passive, emaciated victims herded to their doom, and of heroic Allied soldiers arriving like cavalry to bestow freedom. This narrative is true, but it is not complete. It is a photograph with a crucial part of the image cropped out. The full picture, the one we will uncover, is far more complex, more challenging, and ultimately more profound. The central thesis of this story is that the liberation of Buchenwald was not a simple act of deliverance. It was a staggering testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a battle won not just by tanks and guns from the outside, but by whispers, sabotage, and unimaginable courage from within. This is not just a story of victims. It is a story of agents. It proves that even in the deepest abyss of dehumanization, where individuals are stripped of their names, their families, and their futures, The will to resist, to organize, and to fight back can endure. The accepted myth portrays concentration camp inmates as tragically broken figures, waiting for history to save them. The truth of Buchenwald is that in the final decisive hours, they saved themselves. The lie on the telephone was not a random act of a lone individual. It was the final brilliant move in a long and secret war, a war waged by the condemned in the very heart of darkness. This is the story of how that war was fought, and how, against all odds, it was won. To understand the miracle of April 11th, 1945, we must first descend into the world that produced it. We must go back to the beginning, to the origins of Buchenwald, and dismantle the myth of the passive victim. This myth, born from the initial shock and horror of liberation newsreels, flattens a complex human reality. It imagines the millions of souls caught in the Nazi camp system as a monolith of suffering, a sea of gaunt faces and striped uniforms, their individuality erased, their spirits extinguished. While the suffering was absolute, the response to it was not. The prisoners of Buchenwald were not a homogeneous group. They were a microcosm of a continent at war. German communists, social democrats, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, criminals, and later thousands of political prisoners from across occupied Europe, Soviet prisoners of war, and in the final brutal years, a massive influx of Jews. Each arrived with their own history, their own skills, and their own capacity for hope or despair. The Nazi system was designed to obliterate these distinctions, to grind every individual into a numbered, interchangeable part in a machine of slave labor and death. But it never fully succeeded. The very location of Buchenwald is a study in brutal irony. It was built in 1937 on the Ettersberg, a wooded hill just 5 miles from Weimar. This was not some remote, forgotten corner of Germany. This was its cultural and spiritual heartland. Weimar was the city of the German Enlightenment, home to the poets Goethe and Schiller, the composer Liszt, the philosopher Nietzsche. It was the birthplace of the Bauhaus movement and the namesake of Germany's first democratic experiment, the Weimar Republic. Under the shade of a tree known as Goethe's oak, the great poet was said to have written some of his most profound works on humanism and freedom. The SS, with a sense of perverse historical poetry, cleared a patch of forest right next to this oak to build their concentration camp. They built a world of absolute barbarism in the literal shadow of Germany's highest cultural achievements. This juxtaposition was the point. It was a declaration that the ideals of Weimar were dead and that a new, savage order had taken its place. Buchenwald was not, in the Nazi lexicon, a Vernichtungslager, an extermination camp like Auschwitz-Birkenau or Treblinka. There were no industrial-scale gas chambers designed for the sole purpose of mass murder. Its official designation was as a Konzentrationslager, a concentration camp, primarily for political prisoners and slave laborers. Its motto was Vernichtung durch Arbeit, annihilation through labor. Men were to be worked to death. They toiled in the local quarry, a brutal Sisyphean task of hauling massive stones up a path known as the Stairway of Death. They worked in the Gustloff Work 2, a vast armaments factory built on site, producing rifles and munitions for the German war machine. The camp was a vital economic engine for the SS, a corporation built on human slavery. Life inside was a meticulously engineered hell designed to strip away every vestige of humanity. A prisoner's day began before dawn with a shrill whistle blast for Apple, the roll call. For hours, tens of thousands of men, clad in thin, striped uniforms, stood in rigid formation on the vast parade ground, regardless of the weather. They stood in freezing rain, in driving snow, in the sweltering summer heat. The SS guards and their vicious dogs prowled the lines, beating anyone who swayed or collapsed. The roll calls were an instrument of control, a display of absolute power, and a frequent cause of death. After roll call came the meager breakfast, a piece of black bread and a cup of ersatz coffee, before being marched off to 12 hours of back-breaking labor. Malnutrition was a constant, gnawing reality. The official rations were designed for slow starvation, a scientific calculation of the minimum calories needed to extract the maximum amount of work before the body gave out. Disease was rampant. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis swept through the overcrowded, unhygienic barracks like wildfire. And then there was the arbitrary, unpredictable violence. The guards, led by sadistic commandants like Karl Otto Koch and his infamous wife Ilse, had the power of life and death. A prisoner could be beaten to death for looking a guard in the eye, for not working fast enough, for a button being undone on his uniform. Executions were common, carried out by hanging or by a shot to the back of the neck in the camp stables, a facility gruesomely designed to look like a medical examination room to deceive the victims until the last moment. Medical experimentation added another layer of horror. SS Dr. Waldemar Hovey and others conducted horrific experiments on inmates, infecting them with typhus and cholera to test vaccines for the German army, or subjecting them to high-altitude pressure simulations and poison trials. It was a universe governed by pain, fear, and the constant looming presence of a meaningless death. This was the antagonist of our story, not just the SS guards, but the system itself. A system scientifically designed to dehumanize, to atomize, to break the individual will and sever the bonds between men. The Nazis perfected the art of divide and conquer within the camp's own population. They established a complex prisoner hierarchy, a pyramid of misery. At the top were the Funktionshäftlinge, or prisoner functionaries, Kapos, block elders, and foremen. These prisoners, often drawn from the German criminal or political prisoner population, were given positions of authority over their fellow inmates. They received better food, better clothing, and better living quarters. In exchange, they were expected to enforce the SS's brutal discipline. This system was diabolical. It outsourced the daily terror to the victims themselves, creating an atmosphere of mistrust and forcing prisoners into horrific moral compromises. German political prisoners wore red triangles, criminals wore green, Jehovah's Witnesses purple, homosexuals pink, and Jews wore the yellow star, often in combination with another triangle. The SS pitted these groups against one another, fostering resentments and preventing any unified opposition from forming. This was the world before the turning point, a world designed to make resistance impossible. And yet it was within this very structure of division and despair that the seeds of an impossible resistance were sown. The myth says this world broke everyone. The truth is, it forged some into weapons. By the spring of 1945, the world outside Buchenwald's fences was violently transforming. The Thousand-Year Reich was collapsing in a matter of weeks. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Red Army had crossed the Oder River and was closing in on Berlin. In the West, the Anglo-American forces, having crossed the Rhine in March, were now storming across the heart of Germany. For the prisoners of Buchenwald, this geopolitical shift was not an abstract news report. It was a visceral, audible reality. The distant thunder of General Patton's Third Army grew louder each day, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. It was the sound of a closing vice. This sound, the approaching front line, was the inciting incident, the catalyst that shattered the brutal, static equilibrium of the camp. But it was a double-edged sword. For every prisoner who heard the artillery as a symphony of hope, there was the chilling realization that their greatest danger might lie in these final moments. The Nazi regime, in its death throes, was becoming more frenzied, more paranoid, more murderous than ever. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the final solution, issued frantic orders from his bunker. The camps were not to be liberated. No prisoners were to fall into Allied hands alive. They were to be evacuated, force-marched away from the front lines and deeper into what remained of the Reich. Or, if evacuation was not possible, they were to be liquidated. This policy unleashed a new and final wave of horror across the entire camp system, the death marches. At Buchenwald, the camp commandant, Hermann Pister, began to implement these orders with ruthless efficiency. Starting in early April, the camp descended into a state of organized chaos. Thousands of Jewish prisoners were the first to be targeted. They were dragged from their barracks, herded onto the Appellplatz, and forced out of the camp gates at gunpoint. They were given no food, no water, and marched endlessly towards other camps like Flossenburg and Dachau, hundreds of kilometers away. These were not evacuations, they were mobile massacres. Prisoners who collapsed from exhaustion were shot on the spot. The roads of Thuringia became littered with corpses. In just a few days, some 28,000 prisoners were marched out of Buchenwald, An estimated 10,000 of them perished. This is the moment that shatters the myth of passivity. Faced with this final, certain annihilation, a hidden force that had been growing in the shadows for years decided it was time to act. This was the International Camp Committee, the International Lager Committee, or IBK. This was not a spontaneous, desperate mob. It was a disciplined, clandestine government in waiting, a secret army of the damned. The IBK had its roots in the earliest days of the camp, formed by the first inmates, German communists and social democrats who had opposed Hitler from the beginning. They were seasoned political organizers, men who understood ideology, conspiracy, and cell-based organization. Over the years, as political prisoners from France, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the Soviet Union arrived, the committee became truly international. Its leader was a formidable German communist named Walter Bartel. His story is a microcosm of the resistance itself. Arrested in 1933, he had survived years of imprisonment, torture, and multiple concentration camps before arriving at Buchenwald. He was a man forged in the crucible of anti-fascist struggle. Through a long, patient, and incredibly risky strategy, the IBK had managed to slowly infiltrate the camp's internal administration. They maneuvered their members into key functions-Häftlinge positions, as block elders, clerks in the camp offices, and crucially, as kapos in the armaments factory. This gave them a small but vital measure of influence. They could subtly alter work assignments, moving a weakened comrade from the deadly quarry to a less strenuous job in a workshop. They could skim a few extra potatoes from the kitchen. They could manipulate the all-important camp records, changing a prisoner's classification from Jewish to political, or even declaring a man dead on paper to hide him from the SS. Every small act was a victory, a life saved. Their most audacious operations involved weapons and communication. The prisoners working in the Gustloff armament factory began a systematic campaign of sabotage, deliberately miscalibrating machinery to produce faulty rifle barrels or tampering with ammunition. More importantly, they began to steal weapon parts piece by tiny piece. A firing pin here, a spring there, a rifle stock smuggled under a tunic. Over months and years, they painstakingly assembled a small, secret arsenal. Nearly 100 rifles and several light machine guns hidden in caches beneath barrack floors and in secret compartments. At the same time, another group, led by a Polish prisoner named Gwidon Damazyn, the same man who would later answer the fateful phone call, and a Russian prisoner of war, managed to construct a shortwave radio transmitter from scavenged parts. Hidden in the prisoner movie theater, this radio was their lifeline to the outside world, allowing them to pick up BBC broadcasts and track the Allies' advance with precision. They knew exactly where Patton's tanks were. As the death marches began in early April, the IBK faced a terrible choice. Should they act now and risk a premature suicidal uprising that would be crushed by the thousands of SS guards still at the camp? Or should they wait and risk watching the camp be emptied and every last prisoner marched to their death? They chose a third path, organized passive resistance. They used their network to spread the word. Do not go to the Appellplatz. Hide. Resist the evacuation orders. They hid hundreds of boys and young men in barracks designated as typhus wards, knowing the SS feared entering them. They used their administrative positions to sow confusion and delay the transports. Every hour they bought, the American guns grew louder. On April 8th, using their hidden radio, they managed to transmit a desperate, coded message to the advancing American forces. It was a plea for help, broadcast in Morse code, written in German by Walter Bartel, and translated into English by a captured British officer. To the Allies, to the army of General Patton, this is the Buchenwald concentration camp. SOS, we request help. They want to evacuate us. The SS wants to destroy us. They repeated the message 3 times. They had no idea if it had been received. But they had thrown their final desperate message in a bottle into the ether. They had done all they could. Now the final confrontation was inevitable. The stage was set for the last act of defiance, an act that would be triggered by the ringing of a telephone. The 11th of April, 1945. Dawn broke over Buchenwald to a scene of surreal calm and unbearable tension. The last major transport of prisoners had been forced out of the camp the day before. The remaining 21,000 inmates were a cross-section of the camp's population. Those too sick to move, those who had successfully hidden, and the core members of the prisoner resistance who had refused to leave. The SS leadership had vanished, but pockets of guards remained, nervous and unpredictable in the outer ring of watchtowers. The camp existed in a state of suspended animation, a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came from the IBK. With the American forces now confirmed to be just a few kilometers away, Walter Bartell and the committee leadership made their final momentous decision. The time for waiting was over. The time for fighting had begun. The order went out through the clandestine network. Prepare to seize the camp. This was not a decision made in a vacuum. It was the culmination of years of planning, a contingency they had drilled for in secret whispers and coded messages. They knew the layout of the camp better than the SS. They knew where the remaining guards were positioned. And they knew where their weapons were hidden. The forensic breakdown of what happened next reveals a sequence of events that completely overturns the conventional liberation narrative. The first domino to fall was the phone call. When the Gestapo called from Weimar with the order to blow up the camp, it was Gwidon Damazyn, the Polish engineer and radio specialist, who took the call. His cool-headed lie was not a spontaneous stroke of genius, but a tactical decision made possible by the Resistance's intelligence network. They knew the SS command structure had collapsed. They gambled that the Gestapo, in its own panic, would be too disorganized to verify the information. The gamble paid off. The threat of demolition teams, which would have been the prisoners' most certain doom, was neutralized. With that external threat averted, the IBK initiated their internal takeover. The operation was swift and brutally efficient. Resistance units, organized by nationality, moved to their designated targets. The first objective was the main watchtower overlooking the Appelplatz, the very symbol of SS power. A small, armed group of prisoners stormed the tower, overwhelming the few remaining guards with a combination of surprise and sheer force of will. Within minutes, the Nazi swastika flag was torn down, and a makeshift white flag was hoisted in its place, a signal to the approaching Americans that the camp was no longer hostile territory. Simultaneously, other units moved to the hidden weapons caches. The floorboards of barracks were pried up, walls were broken down, and the carefully assembled arsenal was distributed. Men who had been starved and beaten for years, men who were just hours from death, now held rifles and machine guns. The psychological transformation was instantaneous. They were no longer Häftlinge, inmates. They were soldiers. They formed squads and fanned out through the camp, securing key points: the kitchens, the infirmary, the administrative buildings. They hunted down the remaining SS guards and capos who had not yet fled, capturing dozens and locking them in the same cells where their comrades had been tortured. By early afternoon, hours before the first American soldier would set foot inside the gate, the prisoners of Buchenwald were in full control of their own prison. They had liberated themselves. This is the stunning twist, the truth that stands in stark opposition to the myth. When the first American reconnaissance patrol from the 6th Armored Division, led by Captain Frederick Keffer, cautiously approached the main gate of Buchenwald around 3:15 p.m., they were met with a sight that defied all their expectations. They had prepared themselves for the worst, for scenes of massacre, for desperate, starving wraiths begging for food. Instead, they saw thousands of cheering men, some of them armed, waving jubilantly from behind the fences. A committee of prisoners greeted them at the gate, not as beggars, but as a victorious army. The prisoners formally handed over the camp to the Americans. The liberators had arrived to find the job already done. The ripple effect of this self-liberation was immense. Firstly, it saved thousands of lives. Had the prisoners waited passively, a last-minute massacre by vengeful guards or the arrival of the Gestapo demolition squad was not just possible, but probable. By taking control, the IBK ensured the safety of the remaining inmates and secured the camp. Secondly, it preserved the evidence. The crematoria, the execution sites, the medical labs, the meticulous records of Nazi bureaucracy, all of it was captured intact. This evidence would prove crucial in the post-war Nuremberg trials, providing irrefutable proof of the regime's crimes. The dominoes continued to fall as more American troops and personnel arrived in the following days. The sight, smell, and human reality of Buchenwald sent a shockwave through the Allied command. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, made a personal visit on April 12th. He was a hardened soldier who had seen the worst of war, but what he saw at Buchenwald visibly shook him. He saw the piles of emaciated corpses, the ovens of the crematorium, the terrified skeletal survivors. He famously insisted on touring every corner of the camp, so that I could give first-hand evidence of these things if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations to propaganda. He immediately ordered journalists and delegations of German civilians from Weimar to be brought to the camp to witness the horrors for themselves, forcing a confrontation with the truth. One of those journalists was the legendary broadcaster Edward R. Murrow. His radio report from Buchenwald, broadcast to millions of Americans, remains one of the most powerful pieces of journalism in history. He did not spare his listeners the details. He described the living dead, the acres of skin and bone, and the smell that he would never be able to scrub from his memory. He concluded with the haunting words, "I have reported what I saw and heard, but only part of it. For most of it, I have no words. If I've offended you by this rather mild account of Buchenwald, I'm not in the least sorry." The reports from Eisenhower and Murrow cemented the image of Buchenwald in the global consciousness as a symbol of ultimate evil. But what was largely lost in these initial horrified reports was the incredible story of the prisoner uprising that had made their visit possible. The narrative naturally focused on the victims' suffering and the Allies' role as liberators. The truth, that the prisoners were also their own liberators, was a more complex story, one that would take decades to fully emerge from the shadows of history. The autopsy of April 11th reveals a crucial lesson. History is often written by the victors with the loudest voices, but the truest stories are sometimes found in the actions of those who had no voice at all until they seized it for themselves. The story of Buchenwald did not end on April 11, 1945. Liberation was not an endpoint, but a new, complex beginning. The long-term consequences of what happened on that hill above Weimar would echo for decades, shaped and reshaped by the seismic political forces of the post-war world. The legacy of the camp, and particularly of its heroic self-liberation, became a contested narrative, a mirror reflecting the deep ideological divides of the Cold War. In the immediate aftermath, the camp became a massive displaced persons center, managed by the Allies as they struggled to nurse the survivors back to health and repatriate them. But just a few months later, a dark and bitter irony descended upon Buchenwald. In August 1945, the American forces withdrew from Thuringia as per the Yalta Agreement, and the region became part of the Soviet occupation zone. The Soviet secret police, the NKVD, immediately repurposed the site. Buchenwald was reopened as Special Camp No. 2, a prison for suspected Nazis, low-level functionaries, and increasingly for political opponents of the new Soviet-backed communist regime. The fences were re-electrified, the barracks once again filled with starving prisoners. Over the course of 5 years, more than 28,000 people were imprisoned in the Soviet camp at Buchenwald, and over 7,000 of them died from malnutrition and disease, their bodies dumped in mass graves in the same forest where SS victims lay. A place of unimaginable suffering under one totalitarian regime had become a place of suffering under another. This grim chapter complicates the simple moral clarity of the Buchenwald story, serving as a chilling reminder that the machinery of oppression can be easily repurposed by new masters. When the Soviet camp was finally closed in 1950, the site fell under the control of the newly formed German Democratic Republic, or East Germany. The communist GDR leadership seized upon the story of the Buchenwald resistance with fervor. For them, it was the perfect founding myth. The IBK had been led primarily by German communists like Walter Bartel. The East German state elevated these men to the status of national heroes, celebrating their anti-fascist struggle as the moral bedrock of the new socialist nation. The Buchenwald Memorial, established in the 1950s, was designed to emphasize this narrative above all others. The focus was on the heroic political resistance of the communists, symbolized by the red triangle. The suffering of other victim groups, the Jews, the Roma, the homosexuals, was often downplayed or ignored. The story of the self-liberation was told, but it was a story tailored for political ends, a tool to legitimize the rule of the Communist Party. The universal horror was subordinated to a specific state-sanctioned ideology. After the reunification of Germany in 1990, the memorial was redesigned to present a more complete and honest history. The suffering of all victim groups was given its proper place. The story of the Soviet Special Camp No. 2, which had been a taboo subject in East Germany, was finally told. The legacy of Buchenwald was acknowledged in all its painful complexity. So what is the universal lesson we can draw from this tangled history? It is a lesson about human agency. The story of the Buchenwald resistance teaches us that victimhood is a condition, not an identity. Even when stripped of every right, every possession, and every shred of dignity, humans retain a final, inviolable freedom, the power to choose their response. The prisoners of the IBK could have chosen despair. They could have chosen to collaborate for their own survival. Instead, they chose solidarity. They chose to organize, to plan, to hope, and ultimately to fight. Their story redefines heroism, moving it away from the battlefield and into the darkest corners of human experience. It shows us that heroism can be as quiet as stealing a potato for a starving comrade, as meticulous as building a radio one wire at a time, or as audacious as a single lie spoken over a telephone. This lesson resonates profoundly in our modern world. We live in an age of immense, often overwhelming forces. Global pandemics, climate change, political polarization, and the pervasive influence of digital disinformation. It is easy to feel powerless, to feel like history is something that happens to us, not something we create. The story of Buchenwald is a powerful antidote to this cynicism. It reminds us that history is not solely shaped by great armies or powerful leaders. It is also shaped by the collective actions of ordinary people who refuse to accept the world as it is given to them. The men of the IBK faced a system of absolute power designed to crush their will, and yet they found the cracks in that system. They used the very tools of their oppression, their positions within the camp administration, their access to the factory, as weapons of resistance. Their story is a potent reminder of the power of truth and the strategic power of a lie. In an era of fake news and propaganda designed to confuse and demoralize, the clarity of Gwidon Damazyn's bluff is a bolt of lightning. It was a lie in service of a greater truth, the truth of human dignity and the right to live. It demonstrates that a single well-placed act of defiance, a single disruption of an oppressor's narrative, can have an impact far beyond its immediate scale. In the end, Buchenwald is more than a memorial to the dead. It is a living classroom of human potential. It stands as a permanent, chilling warning of what happens when ideology is placed above humanity, when bureaucracy is used to implement barbarism. But it is also a monument to something more enduring. It is a testament to the fact that even in the deepest, most suffocating darkness, the human spirit can forge its own light. The final defining sound on the Ettersberg Hill in April 1945 was not the explosion the Gestapo had ordered. It was the sound of silence that followed a lie. It was the sound of chains breaking. It was the sound of 21,000 people taking a breath of freedom they had earned for themselves, a sound that continues to echo through history, teaching us a timeless lesson about the unbreakable, indomitable power of the human will. If this story moved you, give the video a like so more people can discover it. And if you want more deep documentary-style explorations of military history, hit subscribe and ring the bell, because the next episodes will be even more powerful. Thank you.